Have you ever wondered why certain people can't seem to get you out of their mind? Why someone who started as just a friend suddenly begins showing up everywhere you are? Why they remember every detail of conversations you've forgotten? Carl Jung, one of the most brilliant psychologists in history, discovered something extraordinary about human obsession. He found that when someone becomes secretly obsessed with you, they exhibit three unmistakable psychological patterns that most people never notice. But once you know these signs, you'll spot them immediately. What's fascinating is that these discoveries, made nearly a century ago, explain perfectly what we see in modern relationships, social media behavior, and even workplace dynamics. Jung realized that obsession isn't random. It follows specific psychological laws. The person who becomes obsessed with you isn't choosing to do so consciously. They're responding to deep unconscious forces that even they don't understand. But before we dive into this topic, I want to ask you something. How old are you, and where are you watching us from? Have you ever experienced situations where a male friend you considered just a friend gradually started developing feelings for you? Or have you noticed that while the guy you like ignores you, a regular guy you hang out with naturally becomes completely infatuated with you? After subscribing to the channel and liking the video, write your experiences in the comments along with your name. Let's examine your story together. You can also send this video to your loved ones so they can learn these teachings too. Tonight, I'm going to reveal Jung's 3 signs that someone is secretly obsessed with you. By the end of this video, you'll understand why some people become completely captivated by you, while others remain indifferent. You'll recognize the subtle psychological patterns that reveal hidden obsession, and most importantly, you'll know how to protect yourself from unwanted psychological attachment, while understanding when someone's feelings for you have crossed the line from healthy attraction into dangerous territory. Jung discovered that obsession begins with what he called psychological projection. When someone projects onto you, they're not seeing the real you. They're seeing their own unconscious desires, their unexpressed parts, their deepest psychological needs reflected in you. You become a living symbol of everything they wish they could be or have. This is why the obsession feels so intense to them. You're not just another person. You're the key to their psychological completeness. Let me tell you about Maria, a 28-year-old graphic designer who experienced this firsthand. Maria was naturally confident, creative, and spoke her mind freely. She met David at a work conference. David was quiet, analytical, very structured in his thinking. During their first conversation, Maria noticed David hanging on every word she said. She thought he was just being polite, but Jung would have recognized immediately what was happening. David wasn't just listening to Maria, he was psychologically feeding off her energy. Maria represented everything David had suppressed in himself: her confidence, her creativity, her spontaneity. These were parts of David's personality that he had never allowed himself to express. Over the following weeks, David began what Jung would call unconscious psychological stalking, not the obvious, threatening kind, but the subtle, seemingly innocent kind that most people miss. This brings us to Jung's first sign that someone is secretly obsessed with you. They begin mirroring your psychological patterns while simultaneously trying to become indispensable in your life. Here's how this manifests. The obsessed person starts adopting your interests, your speaking patterns, even your opinions. They don't do this consciously. It's an unconscious attempt to merge psychologically with you. David suddenly became interested in graphic design. He started using creative expressions Maria often used. He began dressing more like her style. But here's the crucial part. Jung discovered, while they're mirroring you, they're also trying to make themselves essential to your daily life. David started sending Maria helpful articles about design. He offered to help with her projects. He remembered every personal detail she shared and followed up on them. To Maria, David seemed like an incredibly thoughtful friend, but Jung would have seen this as psychological infiltration. David was unconsciously trying to weave himself into Maria's psychological landscape so thoroughly that she couldn't imagine her life without him. The key warning sign Jung identified is this: when someone mirrors your psychological patterns while simultaneously becoming overly helpful or attentive, they're not just being nice, they're unconsciously trying to create psychological dependency. They want to become so integrated into your life that losing them would feel like losing part of yourself. This leads us to Jung's second sign. They develop what he called selective hypervigilance about your emotional states and personal details. The obsessed person becomes psychologically attuned to you in ways that go far beyond normal friendship or romantic interest. They notice micro changes in your mood that even close friends miss. They remember details about your life that you don't remember sharing. They can sense your emotional state from subtle cues that others overlook. Maria started noticing that David seemed to know things about her emotional state that she hadn't directly communicated. If she had a stressful day at work, David would somehow sense it and show up with coffee. If she mentioned being excited about a project, David would remember every detail and ask about it weeks later. At first, Maria found this touching. She thought David was just unusually perceptive and caring, but Jung discovered that this hypervigilance isn't caring. It's psychological obsession manifesting as extreme attention. The obsessed person becomes so focused on you that they unconsciously dedicate enormous mental energy to studying and predicting your psychological patterns. They're not doing this to better support you as a friend. They're doing it because their unconscious mind has identified you as psychologically essential to their well-being. Here's what's happening. Psychologically, the obsessed person's unconscious mind has decided that their psychological completeness depends on maintaining connection with you, so their mind automatically prioritizes information about you above almost everything else. They notice details about your emotional state because their unconscious is constantly monitoring for any sign that you might withdraw from their life. Jung found that this creates a very specific behavioral pattern. The obsessed person will often know things about your schedule, your preferences, your habits that they have no logical reason to know. They'll remember conversations in detail that meant little to you but everything to them. They'll notice changes in your appearance, your mood, your energy that others miss entirely. But here's where it becomes concerning. This selective hypervigilance often leads to the obsessed person trying to anticipate and fulfill your needs before you express them. They start showing up with solutions to problems you didn't know you had. They begin offering help for challenges you haven't mentioned. To them, this feels like being a good friend. But psychologically, they're trying to prove their indispensability by demonstrating that they understand you better than anyone else. This brings us to Jung's most revealing third sign. They develop what he called emotional regulation dependency. This is the most dangerous sign because it's the hardest to recognize and the most psychologically invasive. The obsessed person unconsciously begins using you to regulate their own emotional state. Your moods, your attention, your approval become the primary factors that determine their psychological well-being. Here's how Maria first noticed this pattern with David. When she was happy and engaging with him, David seemed energized, confident, almost like a different person. But when Maria was distant or focused on other things, David's mood would visibly shift. He'd become subdued, anxious, or sometimes subtly irritable. At first, Maria thought David was just empathetic, but Jung would have recognized this as emotional regulation dependency. David was unconsciously using Maria's emotional state to determine his own psychological equilibrium. This manifests in very specific ways. The obsessed person's day is made or ruined by small interactions with you. A smile from you creates disproportionate happiness. A lack of response to a text creates disproportionate anxiety. Their emotional state becomes tied to your emotional state in ways that go far beyond normal friendship or romantic interest. But here's the most concerning aspect, Jung discovered. When someone develops emotional regulation dependency on you, they unconsciously begin trying to control your emotional state to maintain their own psychological stability. They might become subtly manipulative, using guilt, excessive helpfulness, or emotional appeals to ensure you continue providing the psychological validation they've become addicted to. David started making comments about how much better Maria's day seemed when they talked. He'd mention how happy it made him to help her with projects. He began expressing hurt feelings when Maria didn't respond to his messages quickly. To Maria, these seemed like signs that David cared about their friendship. But Jung would have seen these as signs that David's psychological well-being had become unhealthily dependent on Maria's attention and approval. The person experiencing emotional regulation dependency will often say things like, "You always make my day better, I don't know what I'd do without you, talking to you is the highlight of my day." While these might sound like compliments, Jung recognized them as signs of psychological dependency. The obsessed person isn't just appreciating you, they're revealing that their emotional stability requires your presence. This creates a very dangerous dynamic. The obsessed person begins unconsciously pressuring you to maintain their emotional equilibrium. They might become hurt or anxious when you're busy with other things. They might express disappointment when you don't match their level of emotional investment in the relationship. They might start making subtle demands on your time and attention that feel caring, but are actually controlling. Jung discovered that emotional regulation dependency often leads to what he called psychological possession. The obsessed person begins to feel entitled to your emotional energy, your time, your attention. They unconsciously start believing that you exist to fulfill their psychological needs. When you don't meet these expectations, they experience it as a personal betrayal, even though you never agreed to take responsibility for their emotional well-being. Maria began experiencing this when David started expressing hurt feelings whenever she spent time with other friends. He'd make comments like, "I thought we were going to hang out tonight," even when they had made no such plans. He began showing up at places where Maria would be, claiming it was coincidence. He started offering unsolicited advice about her other relationships, subtly suggesting that her other friends didn't understand her the way he did. Jung found that when someone exhibits all three signs or psychological mirroring, with attempts to become indispensable, selective hypervigilance about your emotional states, and emotional regulation dependency, they've crossed the line from healthy attraction into psychological obsession. This isn't conscious manipulation. The obsessed person genuinely believes they're being a good friend or potential partner, but unconsciously, they've identified you as the solution to their psychological incompleteness. What makes this particularly dangerous is that the obsessed person often appears to be an ideal friend or partner. They're attentive, caring, helpful, always available. They seem to understand you deeply and anticipate your needs perfectly. But Jung realized that this apparent perfection is actually a red flag. No healthy relationship requires someone to be that psychologically attuned to another person. The obsessed person's unconscious mind has essentially decided that their psychological survival depends on maintaining connection with you. This creates enormous unconscious pressure on them to prove their worth to you constantly. They begin living their life around your schedule, your preferences, your emotional needs. While this might seem flattering, Jung recognized it as psychologically unhealthy for both people involved. For the obsessed person, this level of psychological dependency prevents them from developing a complete sense of self. They become psychologically addicted to external validation instead of learning to regulate their own emotions and find meaning in their own life. For the object of obsession, this creates enormous unconscious pressure. Even if you're not aware of the dynamic consciously, your unconscious mind senses that someone's psychological well-being depends on your behavior. This can create feelings of guilt, anxiety, or obligation that you can't quite explain. Jung discovered that obsession often intensifies when the object of obsession tries to create boundaries or distance. This happens because the obsessed person unconsciously experiences any withdrawal of attention as a threat to their psychological survival. They may become more helpful, more attentive, or even subtly guilt-inducing in their attempts to restore the connection they feel they need. David exhibited this pattern when Maria started dating someone else. Instead of accepting this gracefully, David unconsciously escalated his psychological pursuit. He began finding reasons to contact Maria more frequently. He started expressing concern about her new relationship, suggesting that her boyfriend didn't appreciate her unique qualities the way David did. He offered to be available whenever she needed to talk about relationship problems. To Maria, David seemed like a caring friend who was concerned about her well-being. But Jung would have recognized this as the obsessed person's unconscious attempt to position himself as psychologically indispensable during a time when his access to Maria was threatened. David wasn't consciously trying to sabotage Maria's relationship, but his unconscious mind was doing everything possible to maintain psychological connection with her. Jung found that people who become obsessed often have what he called an incomplete psychological structure. They've suppressed or never developed certain aspects of their personality, and they unconsciously seek someone who embodies those missing parts. This is why the obsession feels so intense. The obsessed person isn't just attracted to you, they unconsciously believe you hold the key to their psychological completeness. This is fundamentally different from healthy attraction or love. In healthy relationships, each person maintains their psychological independence while choosing to share their life with another person. In obsession, one person unconsciously believes their psychological well-being depends on the other person's continued presence and attention. The tragedy is that obsession prevents real intimacy. The obsessed person can't see you clearly because they're projecting their own psychological needs onto you. They fall in love with their projection of you, not with who you actually are. And you can't develop genuine feelings for someone who doesn't see the real you, only their idealized version of what you represent to them. Jung also discovered that obsession tends to follow predictable patterns based on psychological type. Introverted thinking types often become obsessed with people who express emotions freely. Extroverted feeling types often become obsessed with people who seem psychologically independent and self-contained. The obsessed person unconsciously seeks someone who embodies the psychological functions they've never developed in themselves. This explains why obsession often feels so one-sided. The person experiencing obsession feels an incredibly intense connection, while the object of obsession feels confused about why this person is so invested in a relationship that doesn't feel equally meaningful to them. The obsessed person is experiencing the psychological projection of their own unexpressed potential, while the other person is just being themselves. Understanding these patterns can help you recognize obsession early and respond appropriately. If someone exhibits all three of Jung's signs mirroring your psychological patterns while trying to become indispensable, showing hypervigilance about your emotional states and personal details, and using you for emotional regulation, you're dealing with psychological obsession, not healthy interest. The appropriate response isn't necessarily to cut off contact completely, especially if the person isn't threatening or harmful, but it's important to maintain clear boundaries and avoid reinforcing the obsessive patterns. Don't reward excessive attention with increased emotional intimacy. Don't allow someone else's emotional regulation to become your responsibility. And don't feel guilty for maintaining psychological independence. Jung believed that obsession could sometimes transform into genuine love if the obsessed person developed enough self-awareness to recognize their projections and take responsibility for their own psychological completeness. But this requires the obsessed person to do considerable psychological work, and it can't be forced or facilitated by the object of obsession. For most people, recognizing these three signs serves as early warning that someone's interest in you has crossed the line from healthy to psychologically dependent. While it might feel flattering initially to have someone so devoted to understanding and pleasing you, Jung understood that this level of psychological dependency ultimately serves no one's highest good. True intimacy requires two psychologically complete individuals who choose each other freely, not someone who needs you to feel psychologically whole. Understanding Jung's insights about obsession can help you recognize the difference and make choices that support genuine connection rather than psychological dependency. The wisdom Jung offers us is this: healthy relationships are built on mutual choice and psychological independence, while obsession is built on unconscious projection and emotional dependency. By understanding these patterns, you can recognize when someone's interest in you has moved beyond attraction into the realm of psychological obsession, and you can respond in ways that protect both your well-being and theirs. Remember, being the object of someone's obsession isn't a compliment, it's a sign that they're not seeing the real you, but rather their own projected psychological needs. True appreciation and love come from someone who sees you clearly and chooses you anyway, not from someone who needs you to feel psychologically complete. Jung's insights help us understand the difference and choose relationships that support our psychological growth rather than our psychological dependency. But there's something even more profound that Jung discovered about these obsession patterns. He found that understanding them doesn't just protect you from unwanted psychological dependency, it actually reveals something crucial about your own psychological development and the unconscious messages you're sending to others. Jung realized that people who consistently attract obsessive attention often possess what he called psychological magnetism. They embody qualities that others desperately want to develop in themselves. This isn't necessarily a problem, but it becomes one when you're unaware of the psychological signals you're unconsciously broadcasting. Think about Maria's situation again. Her natural confidence, creativity, and spontaneity weren't just attractive qualities, they were psychological beacons that attracted people like David, who had suppressed these same qualities in themselves. Maria wasn't doing anything wrong, but her lack of awareness about her psychological impact left her vulnerable to attracting dependent relationships. Jung discovered that when you understand your own psychological magnetism, you can learn to attract conscious connection instead of unconscious dependency. This requires developing what he called integrated awareness, understanding both your conscious personality and your unconscious psychological signals. Here's what Jung found particularly fascinating. The same psychological qualities that attract obsessive attention can also attract the healthiest, most conscious people, but only when you understand how to communicate psychological boundaries while maintaining your natural magnetism. Maria's story had an interesting continuation. After recognizing David's obsessive patterns, she began studying Jung's work on psychological projection and attraction. She learned to recognize when someone was seeing their own unexpressed potential in her, rather than seeing her as a complete individual. More importantly, she learned to communicate early in relationships that she was attracted to people who were working on their own psychological completeness, not seeking someone else to complete them. This subtle shift in how Maria presented herself began attracting entirely different types of people. Instead of drawing individuals like David, who needed her to regulate their emotions, she started connecting with people who appreciated her qualities while maintaining their own psychological independence. Jung called this transformation conscious magnetism, the ability to attract others from a place of psychological awareness rather than unconscious neediness. When you develop conscious magnetism, you naturally repel people who are seeking psychological dependency while attracting those who are capable of genuine intimacy. But here's where Jung's insights become even more practical for modern life. He discovered that obsessive patterns don't just occur in romantic contexts, they appear in friendships, workplace relationships, and even casual social interactions. Understanding these patterns helps you navigate all your relationships more consciously. In professional settings, for example, Jung's 3 signs can help you recognize when a colleague's helpfulness has crossed into psychological dependency. The coworker who mirrors your work style, remembers excessive details about your projects, and seems emotionally affected by your professional approval, may be exhibiting the same obsessive patterns that occur in personal relationships. Jung found that people who understand these dynamics become more effective leaders because they can recognize when their influence is creating healthy inspiration versus unhealthy dependency. They learn to encourage others' growth without becoming psychological crutches. In friendships, recognizing these patterns helps you distinguish between someone who genuinely enjoys your company and someone who needs your attention to feel psychologically stable. True friends maintain their own emotional equilibrium while choosing to spend time with you. Psychologically dependent friends require your emotional energy to maintain their psychological balance. Jung also discovered something crucial about the digital age. Though he couldn't have predicted social media specifically, He understood that psychological projection and obsessive patterns would intensify in any environment where people could create idealized images of themselves. Social media has created exactly this environment, amplifying the unconscious projection mechanisms that Jung identified. Online obsession follows the same three patterns Jung discovered, but with additional complications. The digital realm allows obsessed individuals to study your psychological patterns through your posts, photos, and interactions without your awareness. They can mirror your interests by adopting similar content strategies. They can demonstrate selective hypervigilance by remembering and responding to details from your online presence. And they can use your digital responses to regulate their own emotional state. Understanding Jung's insights about obsession becomes even more critical in digital relationships, because the usual social cues that would alert you to someone's psychological dependency are often absent online. Someone can exhibit all three obsessive patterns through digital interaction, while maintaining apparent normalcy in face-to-face encounters. Jung's work suggests that the antidote to unwanted obsessive attention, both online and offline, isn't to become less authentic or hide your psychological magnetism. Instead, it's to develop clearer psychological boundaries and better recognition skills. When you understand the difference between healthy appreciation and psychological dependency, you can respond appropriately to each. This brings us to Jung's ultimate insight about obsession and attraction. The goal isn't to avoid being seen or appreciated, but to ensure that others are seeing the real you rather than their own psychological projections. When someone truly sees you, their interest feels supportive and energizing rather than demanding and draining. Healthy attraction creates mutual inspiration. Both people feel encouraged to become better versions of themselves through the relationship. Obsessive attraction creates psychological drainers. One person feels energized, while the other feels depleted from carrying the emotional responsibility for someone else's psychological well-being. Jung believed that understanding these dynamics was essential for psychological maturity. People who never learn to recognize obsessive patterns often spend their lives either attracting unhealthy dependency or unconsciously becoming dependent on others. Those who develop this awareness can choose relationships that support mutual growth and genuine intimacy. As we conclude this exploration of Jung's insights, remember that recognizing these patterns isn't about judging others or becoming suspicious of genuine care and attention. It's about developing the psychological discernment that allows you to distinguish between healthy connection and unconscious dependency. Jung's three signs: psychological mirroring, with attempts to become indispensable, selective hypervigilance about your emotional states, and emotional regulation dependency, serve as guideposts for recognizing when someone's interest in you has moved beyond appreciation into psychological obsession. But perhaps most importantly, understanding these patterns helps you develop more conscious relationships in all areas of your life. When you recognize the difference between healthy attraction and psychological dependency, you can make choices that support genuine intimacy rather than unconscious projection. The wisdom Jung offers isn't just about protecting yourself from unwanted obsession. It's about understanding the profound responsibility that comes with psychological magnetism and learning to use that influence in ways that support everyone's psychological growth and authentic connection. If this exploration of Jung's discoveries resonates with you, if you want to continue diving into the depths of human psychology with us, subscribe to this channel and hit that notification bell. Share your experiences in the comments. Have you recognized these patterns in your own relationships? Understanding these psychological dynamics is the first step toward building healthier, more conscious connections with others.